Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on lesson 27 of the Acts of the Apostles, and we're covering Acts chapter 14, verses 1 through 18. This one's called Idolatry. This chapter of Acts concludes Paul's first missionary journey, and Barnabas joined him on all legs of the journey, while John Mark returned to Jerusalem after Cyprus. Paul saw the same result that most of us see when sharing the gospel. Some received the gospel, some rejected it. In fact, it is more like the parable of the sower and the soils in Matthew 13 shared by Jesus. I think most of us hope to see what occurred to Jonah when all of the people of Nineveh repented and turned to the Lord. Of course, that was not what Jonah wanted. Instead, Jonah's heart desired for his enemies to be judged instead of saved. Let's read our first passage today. Acts chapter 14, verses 1 through 7 says this. Now it happened in Iconium that they went together to the synagogue of the Jews, and so spoke that a great multitude, both of the Jews and of the Greeks, believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles, and poisoned their minds against the brethren. Therefore they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. Both the multitude of the city was divided. Part sided with the Jews, and part with the apostles. And when a violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and Jews, with their rulers, to abuse and stone them, they became aware of it, and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Iconium, and to the surrounding region, and they were preaching the gospel there. Paul and Barnabas shared the gospel with everyone, but this passage says that the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. Think about this for a moment. In the days of Paul and Barnabas, it would take days to travel between locations most of the time. When they arrived in a new location, the typical way of addressing the town was to go to the local synagogue. How many people was Paul able to talk to on a daily basis? Things have changed greatly because of the internet, where we can have a message viewed by many, many people in a variety of locations all around the world. Sadly, most of the comments on my videos are from atheists who are trying to destroy the dissemination of God's message. That is exactly what the unbelieving Jews were doing in the days of Paul. All of us are searching for the truth, or should be, but that search is unique and personal for each of us. It continues to amaze me that there are so many people who are so opposed to the belief in God, belief in Jesus, and belief in the works of Jesus, that they are willing to go to any extreme to condemn others who believe. Shouldn't it be enough to come to one's own conclusion and allow others to do the same? I think the reason for this is demonic influence. Satan desperately wants to discredit God through his lies, as he cannot discredit God through truth. This should bring us back to Matthew 13. Matthew 13, verses 1 through 9 says this. On the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea, and great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. Then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. Some fell on stony places, where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Fortunately for us, Jesus gave the interpretation of this parable. Matthew 13, verses 18 through 23 says this: "Therefore hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he who received seed by the wayside. But he who received the seed on stony places, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. Now he who received seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. But he who received seed on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Through the disbelieving Jews, Satan tried to snatch the seed away from those who had received it from Paul and Barnabas. We need to understand that we are called to share the gospel with others, but only through the Holy Spirit will the gospel be received. That is entirely up to God. Remember, not everyone who heard the gospel from Jesus received it. This statement is interesting. Speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. The apostles were different from us. In fact, God had gifted them with the ability to perform signs and wonders. That included the ability to cast out demons, heal the sick and infirm, and even to make the dead alive again. No one questioned whether or not Peter was an apostle of Jesus, as Peter had walked with Jesus for 3 years. After the ascension of Jesus, Peter performed many signs and wonders, and this is one of the ways that God acknowledged to the people that he had given the authority to the apostles to continue the ministry of Jesus. Personally, I never have seen a believer restore a dead body back to life, nor have I seen a believer cast a demon out of another. Healings occur, but by the hand of God, not by a charlatan faith healer who requests money for that service. These are called apostolic gifts for a reason. And in my opinion, these gifts stopped at the death of John, the last apostle. But God did something extra special by empowering Paul with the apostolic gifts. While no one questioned whether or not Peter was an apostle, many questioned whether or not Paul was an apostle. In all 13 of the epistles written by Paul, he claimed to be an apostle. This does not sound like bragging to me. When God gave Paul the ability to perform these signs and wonders, it was God's divine authentication that Paul was called to be an apostle. When Paul spoke, he spoke with God's authority. Paul and Barnabas fled Iconium because the people tried to stone them. I'm certain that Paul at least considered the irony that it had not been that many years since he had tended the coats of the men who were stoning Stephen to death, and now he was in Stephen's position. Jesus had saved Paul, and Paul could see the same hatred in the faces of the people wanting to stone him that he had once exhibited. Let's read the next passage. Acts chapter 7, verses 8 through 18 says this: "And in Lystra, a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, 'Stand up straight on your feet.' And he leaped and walked. Now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Iconium language, 'The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men.' And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. In this passage, we can see that Paul healed a man who had been lame since birth. Peter did something similar in Acts 3. At the beautiful gate of the temple, Peter restored a man who had been lame since birth, and immediately he was walking and leaping and praising God. In Acts 14, another man lame since birth was instantly leaping. This reveals an aspect of God's healing that we might overlook. Many of us have been through injuries that involve rehabilitation. But imagine muscles, tendons, and bones that never have been used in both of these situations were all so finely tuned that the men leapt into the air. There was no learning to walk as babies do. Instead, each of these men went from fully lame to fully healed with a word uttered by Peter or Paul. That is the picture of our healing when we are saved. We don't start as partially saved and somewhere down the road hopefully advance to fully saved. When we come to Jesus in faith and belief, he wipes our slates clean. That means that all sins are forgiven, past, present, and future. There's also something else going on here that is going to take some explanation. The people are misattributing the miracles of God, the power of God, and the gospel message of God to someone other than God. Idolatry existed pervasively, and while Jews and Christians worship one God, the Greeks and Romans were polytheistic. In fact, all the gods of the Greeks and Romans had specific functions. The people believed that there were times when the Greek and Roman gods came to earth and visited the people. One specific story in Greek mythology spoke of a visitation by Zeus, who is the king of the gods, and his son Hermes. They came to the land of Phrygia and dressed as humble mortals, not gods. No one offered shelter to them in the towns until an elderly couple, Bacchus and Philemon, offered for these two men to eat from their meager provisions and stay with them in their sparsely furnished home. In exchange, these gods changed the home into a huge temple, gave them long life, and they became trees when they died. Amazingly, that story involved the exact location where Paul and Barnabas were teaching. Consequently, the people in our Bible passage were familiar with that story and did not want to treat these gods with hospitality, without hospitality like most had in the story. But Paul wanted them to know that he and Barnabas were not gods, even though the people wanted to perform sacrifices on behalf of Paul and Barnabas, who they were referring to as Hermes and Zeus. In Roman mythology, they would have been called Jupiter and Mercury. Paul reminded the people that he and Barnabas were men, just like they were. The gods these people worshipped were useless and non-existent. There only was one God, and he was eternal. He created everything they could see and everything that they could not see. These people tried to appease their gods by sacrifices, and by keeping those gods happy, they thought that their crops would grow and their lives would be enriched. Instead, Paul wanted them to know that the abundant life offered by Jesus was one of love, joy, and peace. Most people are governed by misbelief and superstition. Baseball pitchers win a big game, and wear the same pair of unwashed underwear in the next game, somehow attributing the victory to an article of clothing. But even after walking away from the superstitions of Greek and Roman mythology, people retained similar traits. Just as the Greeks had gods for each specific function, we see people wearing St. Christopher medals. Of course, that is the Catholic saint of travelers. Some pray to St. Michael the Archangel for protection, to St. Francis for animals, to St. Jude for desperate causes. Here's a thought. Instead of praying to an angel or to dead humans, pray to the living God. Some think he is too busy to hear our prayers. For those who think that, your God is smaller than my God. Your God is less powerful than my God. God knows all, has all power, and can be everywhere at the same time. Don't waste time on Zeus or Hermes. Don't waste time on Catholic saints either. That is idolatry, and idolatry points to our sinfulness. We discussed this recently, but think back to Mount Sinai. Moses was on top of the mountain with God, receiving the 10 Commandments, and the Israelites were melting gold, forming it into a calf. It probably resembled the Egyptian bull god Apis and the cow goddess Hathor, or even the statue of the bull located at Wall Street. But doesn't it seem absolutely ludicrous to make something with one's hands and then worship it? We are the works of God's hands. He loves us, but he certainly does not worship us. We worship our Creator, not our creation. We will finish this chapter in the next lesson. Just remember, it might seem like the polytheistic people Paul was preaching to are nothing like the people of today. An idol is anything that gets in between us and our relationship with God. It can be a false god. It can be a golden calf. It can be sex, money, fame. It can be pride, competitiveness, or even intelligence. Some people think they're too smart to believe in God. That is not going to work out very well in the long run. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.